I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth plenary panel at the IMCR World Congress 2020, which is hosted by University of Tampere in Finland, but obviously largely held online as this panel. The title of our panel today is The Role of Science in Global Crisis. I'll be chairing the panel. My name is Thomas Tufte, and I'm a professor of media and communication studies and the director of the Institute for Media and Creative Industries at Loughborough University in London. And it's a truly international panel of distinguished and very experienced scholars that all have accepted to join today from India, from Mexico, from South Africa, and from the Netherlands. However, before I introduce our four panelists, I'd like to say a few words of why we have this panel today. Why are we covering the role of science in global crisis at this point? Obviously, it takes its point of departure in the contemporary COVID-19 crisis, where the role of science, as we all have seen, has been catapulted to prominence in recent months. Many people have followed the national press conferences and have mass consumed media of all kinds to stay at par on government policies and not least on scientists' advice. We've witnessed the role the World Health Organization has gained in the crisis, but also seen the way national governments have drawn upon and have managed science in varying ways in their practices and policies. Both the experience from the WHO and with our national governments are examples that bring forward different perceptions of science and reveal institutionalized positions and practices of science. What we need to understand when tackling a global crisis like this one we currently are experiencing goes beyond what one scientific discipline can say. It speaks to questions of interdisciplinarity, and it calls for broader perspectives upon how to understand and act upon the challenges a crisis like this one poses on the world community. In addition to reflecting upon this interdisciplinarity of science, we will in the panel also address science communication and the challenges, for example, of communicating hard sciences to soft audiences. We've seen a lot of this happen in the current crisis. We will also tackle the issue of the epistemologies that inform our scientific knowledge production and explore the challenges of epistemic freedom. Finally, we'll look into the political dimensions and the political abuse of science. With this panel, we wish to move beyond discussing what expertise is required and focus more on what scientific knowledge must be produced to achieve a more profound understanding of a global crisis like the one we are currently experiencing. It is still early days in producing knowledge and insights about this crisis, but therefore also the timeliness, we believe, of this panel. Allow me to introduce our four speakers and panelists. We have Dr. Vandana Shiva, who's an Indian scholar and environmental activist, and who has dedicated nearly 5 decades of her life to the protection of biodiversity. She's a leader in the International Forum on Globalization and the Earth Democracy Movement, and is the author of over 20 books. And I believe you were also a speaker at the 2008 IMCR World Congress in Stockholm. Welcome back. Secondly, we have Giulietta Fierro, who is currently a researcher at the Institute for Astronomy at Mexico's National University, and she's been a teacher for 50 years, dedicating most of her efforts on public outreach. She's written over 40 books on science popularization for all age levels, and I believe that's also the topic you'll be touching upon today, so welcome to you as well. Thirdly, we have Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Kacheni, who's a professor of African political economy at the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute at the University of South Africa, and currently heading the Change Management Unit in the Vice Chancellor's office. And he'll focus on the struggle for African people to think, theorize, interpret the world, and write from where they are located, unencumbered by Eurocentrism. And I know you've published widely on the academic platforms, and I'd just like to show your last book, which is this one, called The Epistemic Freedom in Africa. And I believe you've also recently accepted a new chair in Germany, and we'll be moving shortly. on, I think it's a chair on epistemologies of the Global South, so I'd like to congratulate you on that. Welcome. Finally, and not least, we have Professor Cees Hamelink, who's a Professor Emeritus of Communication at the University of Amsterdam and a Professor of Human Rights and Public Health at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. And his research focus is on moral philosophy and global communication. And he's published 19 monographs on media culture and communication rights. And I should also say he's one of the honorary presidents of the IMCR. And it's also, together with Marianne de Bruin, the two people behind the initiative to organize this panel. So thank you for that, Cees. I'm glad to have you on board and having invited me in as the chair. I'd like now to pass the word to Dr. Vandana Shiva. So welcome once again, and I'll pass the word on to you.
Thank you. It's good to be with all of you on this very, very important issue. I started life as a physicist, and life was very simple as a physicist because I was dissatisfied with mechanistic explanations of how the world worked, and I followed through to do a doctoral on the foundations of quantum theory. But I was also getting involved with the environmental movement and was realizing that no matter what the field, it could be forestry, it could be rivers and water, later agriculture. Agriculture has occupied literally the last 35 years of my investigation, even though that's not what I thought I would do all my life. And so much of what I have learned about the questions you posed in the list, it was a very long list for a short 6-minute opener. But let me begin by saying there are sciences, scientists to know, sciere, to know. And one knows, every culture knows. And yet there was literally a denial of knowledge. In Europe, I believe the witch hunts were a very important watershed of not acknowledging the knowledge of women, in fact, criminalizing it. But the 1600s are very important, not only because that's where colonialism got formalized in the East India Company, but that's where Thomas Bacon actually writes a book called The Masculine Birth of Time. And when I was trying to make sense of why was forestry the way it was, why were women of my region rising to protect the forests and hugging the trees, that's where I began my journey. And the language of Bacon is quite amazing because he's talking about raping nature. He is talking about we've got to turn her into restrained, bound, and kept in order. Science should be, as it were, it should torture nature's secrets out of her. And with that knowledge, man should become the master and stop exerting a gentle guidance over nature's course, but have the power to conquer and subdue, to shake her to her very foundations. And I think it's that violence, both in the mind as well as the violence it unleashes on the earth, that has given us the crisis we have. I've written a lot about how the corona epidemic itself is a result of a certain system of thinking that allowed invasions into forests, allowed creation of infectious diseases. But for me, science, true science, is always about debate, about discussion, and about recognizing there's plurality, because if science is knowledge, then there are many ways to reach the answers. And what I find quite astonishing is what I've experienced for the last 20 years in that narrow field of GMOs and patenting, where science mutated, literally got genetically engineered into propaganda. So who was writing for Monsanto? It was the PR companies and the employees, Ketchup. It was basically the public relations system. And I think this collapse of science of the dominant science in the hands of big corporations into the hands of the propaganda machine is an important watershed in our times. If 500 years ago, 400 years ago, it was about using it for commerce. Now it is about totally controlling. And having watched the amazing discussion, so many of my scientific friends, epidemiologists, their YouTubes talking about the multiple complexity of the corona being pulled down. Those explaining that the gain of function research financed by the US, carried out in the Wuhan Defense Lab, that gain in function research has created a different virus from a naturally occurring virus, because this virus is not at all behaving like a typical flu virus. It is creating all kinds of systems, and we need, because the severity of crisis, we need openness, we need plurality, we need honesty. Instead, what we are seeing is the behavior of religious fundamentalism and an intolerance I have not witnessed in all of my life. So I think what we are at, it is a watershed for the future of the planet, which is linked very much to the future of knowledge, to the future of science, to the future of communication, the future of media. And I won't go into details, but it's the same big money that is controlling the media, same big money is controlling the technocratic experiment of life, the same big money is finding new places for investment. And therefore, of course, it's not a surprise that true scientists are not the ones who are able to dialogue amongst themselves to find out, A, what's the virus, 2, what is it doing to our body, and 3, what are the true cures. This collapse into one way of looking at it and one way of doing it is no more science. You talked about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. For me, life is about living systems. And all of my work from the time of Quantum Foundations is about understanding systems, whether it's my studies on agriculture or studies on seeds. It is about understanding living systems. And because of the way a reductionist mechanistic approach created systems that made life disappear, and in a way the elephant disappeared. So one blind man saw the ears and said it's a fan, another saw a tail, another saw a leg. No one saw the elephant as a whole. We are at that moment where we need to recognize that systems are systems, and the approach to systems has to be system science. The approach to causality has to be system causality. And this means transcending even interdisciplinarity and getting out of reductionism and mechanistic thought into a systems understanding of the world in its interconnectedness, in its amazing diversity, most importantly, in its ability to evolve and adapt.
Thank you very much. That was a great start, and but with no further ado, I think I'll pass the word straight on to Professor Julieta Fierro in Mexico. So you can continue.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you and share the floor with all of you. It's very exciting. Thanks for the invitation. As Thomas mentioned, I'm an outreach person, and I believe outreach is the art of conveying science to the public. I believe it's very important because about other things apart from the virus, and certain sciences are especially mind-blowing, and it's wonderful to be able to convey this kind of science to the public because they need to think out of the bucket. I think it's important to convey science to industry in the good sense, and then I don't want you to think I want to make industry rich, but I believe science needs to produce new technology, and this technology can be used by industry to produce innovation. A great example of useful innovations are the cell phones. They're relatively cheap. Many people can afford them. They use small amount of materials small amounts of energy, and they are multitasking. If we don't produce more objects like this, we will continue to destroy nature. So we need innovation products in order to not to use up all our natural resources, which is terrible. And that's why science can produce technology that can be useful to create this kind of objects. An example now with the COVID that comes from astronomy, astronomers have studied the filamentary structure of the universe, the way dark matter incorporates visible matter to create galaxies. And these models have been used to study the way lungs inflammate during a very severe sickness of COVID, using artificial intelligence to detect the way lungs are evolving. So it's very important for outreach to reach industry so they understand what technology is being produced by science and they're able to use it for their products. I also feel informal education is important for women. Vandana pointed out this, and I think women's problems have been shut down, and we need more women in science because there are certain problems, for instance, the woman's sicknesses and menstruation problems aren't studied because that's something that only pertains to women. They're in their days, they feel upset because they're strange. But as long as more women aren't incorporated into science, these terrible problems that women suffer all the time, every month, won't be addressed. I also believe outreach should be directed to adults because all of us need to be reconverted. We need to learn new tasks in order to incorporate our jobs to the new world. And the way we find out about these facilities is through outreach. Adults must learn how to learn, and everyone must learn how to learn, so we become long life learners. And the way to enjoy learning is through good outreach experiences. And of course, we need to do outreach for everyone because science is part of culture. And it produces this amazement when we realize the richness of science and the way people on Earth have learned so much about everything, including the stars, the galaxies, the universe. It's truly amazing. Who should do outreach? Well, it would be ideal for scientists to do it because it has to be correct. It has to be rigorous. It has to be subject to refereeing because it can't be just a wild idea. So I believe since not all sciences are good at this, they should work with multidisciplinary groups that include communicators, so that the science that is conveyed to the public is understood, appreciated. It should be a challenge because having challenges in life makes one happy, but it has to be difficult, engaging, and joyful. And the more ways we find to do outreach, the more successful we will be. We need science centers, museums, workshops, lectures, and all kinds of things. We need to use the media, we need books, we need articles. The more, the better. And we also need different ways of conveying science. Some people like to be very formal, and some like to be playful, and some need to use their hands in order to understand. So the more ways we find to convey outreach, well, we will be more successful. as Vandana pointed out, it's important to use the language, the culture of every place. It's one thing isn't good for all, but adapting the science to local cultures can be more meaningful for people. I believe during the pandemic, as Thomas mentioned, there is so much need to know about science, not only pertaining to sickness, the COVID, but also to think about other things, to be surprised about science. I know there's lots of fake news around, and scientific outreach cannot stop fake news. People can work with two sets of mind. At science centers, when they interview people, for instance, on an exhibit of evolution, they say, well, evolution is the way people have evolved. But if outside a science center, a priest asks them, how did the world begin? They say, God created the world, and people were there from the beginning. So since people can use these two sets of mind, well, it's all right if there's fake news, as long as there's also the scientific culture in our world. As long as we are able to convey science in many different ways that makes sense to people, and they feel they can enjoy life through science. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giulietta Fierro, for your presentation. And I'll pass on straight away the word to Professor Novulkacheni. The word is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perhaps I will raise more questions than contributing any answers to this panel. I think one of the already emerging a big challenge to us is the question of which science are we talking about? And I think Vandana has already introduced that very well to say, which science are we talking about? Are we talking about the product of the 16th century scientific revolutions, which has grown to a totalizing rational model, which actually denies the existence of other knowledges? And I think that we will return to that question and when we do the discussions. But my entry point was a poem of 1896, which appeared in the Calcutta Journal. And that poem was entitled The Blessings of Science. And that poem says, science, thou mysterious being, through thy aid we can know it all. Man and nature's mighty laws, what are hid in the future's path? Through thy mighty aid, we mortals flinch the lightning from the clouds. This was a time when people had confidence in science. And I don't think we can say the same thing about science today. And I will highlight two recent developments which actually makes us to then question science itself. The first, I think, is the global financial crisis of 2008, whereby economic sciences or economics could not predict it, and it actually were somehow ambushed by history. With our sciences, we failed to actually predict it. The second, obviously, is the current outbreak of coronavirus and the COVID-19. Again, our science could not predict it, let alone is struggling to deal with it effectively. And if I build on these 2 points, then it takes us to what exactly is the problem which we are facing at the moment. And I think we need to be forthright and say we're living in a time of epistemic crisis. There is a crisis in knowledge. And there is actually something which, for lack of a better word, I will call the exhaustion of existing knowledges, including science, which has been dominant for the past 500 years. And if I turn to the work of the sociology of science, the sociologist of science, Immanuel Wallerstein, he spoke about the uncertainties of knowledges. The uncertainty of knowledge, whereby the scientific generated laws of nature, determinism, and repetition are actually in crisis. And when we escalate that to the field of health sciences, we will then, including medicine, we will then discover that we have been living at a time when we have been failing to cure so many diseases. What we tend to do, which is a sign indeed of an epistemic crisis, is to manage diseases. So many diseases are today managed and they're never cured. And I think we need to be forthright that that's a sign that there is a problem somewhere. And if we accept that crisis, therefore we need to do so many other things in order to move forward. I think the first thing which we need to do is to question the knowledge of knowledge itself. Let's not continue with an old conception of knowledge itself. And if I can use the other expression, to rethink thinking itself, what does it mean to rethink thinking itself? Because it is only then that we can even question the scientific practice rather than worshipping it when it is not offering any solutions to the problems which we are facing. And one of the major problems perhaps for our moment is this issue of using normal times thinking and the normal times theorizing for an exceptional moment. And I think we need to actually think carefully whether the knowledges which actually plunged us into the present crisis or the science which plunged us into the present crisis can be the same science which takes us out of this crisis. And I think we need to think deeply about that. And that is where it then takes me to my book, which you just flagged now, which speaks about epistemic freedom. And I think Vandana also spoke about something related to it, whereby I think we need to go back to the drawing board and say and recognize that all human beings are born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems. And that recognition actually leads us to then recognize the various ways through which diverse people have dealt with the problems which we are facing and they interpreted the world. And when you opened, you spoke about the issue of interdisciplinarity. I have a bit of a question mark about interdisciplinarity from an epistemological point of view. That one of the major problems which we're facing at the moment in the westernized university is the issue of there is a monument at the center of a westernized university, and that is the monument of Eurocentric thought and the Eurocentric epistemology. And if we say we're therefore going to do interdisciplinarity without dealing with that question, we actually reinforce a problem rather than dealing with it. And hence, I will speak more of ecologies of knowledges instead of interdisciplinarity. And perhaps we can also speak about perhaps the possibility of interscience, if there's anything like that. And this takes me to my last point, particularly emerging from the reality of the problem which we are facing at the moment. Because the moment of COVID-19 is also is a disastrous moment, but at the same time is a moment which must lead us to think very deeply about the time we are living in. And one of the issues which I will pose is that the moment of COVID-19, some extent, has actually made the whole world test what the global south have been experiencing for centuries. And that is the issue of uncertainty of life, and indeed exposure to the possibilities of premature death. And if I'm right in that postulation, therefore, it means we will need perhaps to shift the geography of knowledge, if that makes sense, the geography of knowledge in such a way that we shift it from the idea that science is produced by scientists who are just a minority in the world. And as Julieta was speaking about, taking it to the public, it means therefore we're taking it from somewhere, and that somewhere is whereby it is a monopoly of a minority. It is not a knowledge of everyone. And what I'm thinking here, building on the work of one of the African thinkers, Nguku wa Thiong'o, I'm thinking about what he introduced, and I will end with that. He introduced something called the theory, the poor theory, the value of poor theory, or what he called the riches of poor theory. And he argued that when he talks about poor theory, he's talking about being extremely creative and experimental in order to survive. Being extremely creative and experimentally in order, and I think that's the mode in which the world is in at the moment. And I thank you.
Indeed, you did raise many questions, but thank you very much. This was, I think, very useful to think with. I'll pass the word straight on to Professor Cees Hamelink. The word is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we all have at moments viewed a television program which was called Science Quiz on Television. You know, one of these programs in which a guy has a slice of bread in his hand, and then it falls on the kitchen floor. And then the question is to the audience, how will the slice of bread end? With the part where the butter was on, or with the part where there was no butter? And people discuss about it, and then there's always a scientist who explains on which side the slice of bread would end. I find that a perversion of science, because that means that science is seen as finding, smart answers to stupid questions. And I think that is a great match with the public, the media, and the political perception of science, certainly in times of crisis. People expect from science certainty and answers. And I think that comes from a long tradition in education that begins with the Greek philosopher Plato, who said the intelligence of students is measured by their capacity to give answers to questions. I think that's a very dangerous route to go, because in the end, I think what is really the core of our scientific work is the art of asking questions. Now, here immediately you see the collision we have with politics and with policymakers, certainly now also in this COVID-19 crisis. Politicians want to have answers. And in science, we are really better in asking questions. Politicians want to have urgent answers. They want to have them today or yesterday. Whereas science, of course, needs time. We are slow thinkers. We need patience. The other element is that policymakers will always look for some form of consensus, for some form of agreement. And the beauty of science is we live, by contestation. The core of the theory of knowledge is that all theoretical statements can be contested. Isn't that wonderful? And the other thing is, that whereas in politics, we look, of course, for the certainty in uncertain times, we meet up with the problem that science lives with complexity. And politicians want simplicity, simple answers to complex questions. And I don't think we are very good at that. And rather than looking for forms of consensus what we do is we will eternally be looking for the black swan, to contest the thesis that all swans are white. So, we are not very good in providing the kind of evidence that everyone asks for these days. Everything should be evidence-based. But that could be a mistake, because in science we're not very good in proof. Most of what we do is what I would call temporary approximations to complex issues. Temporary. For a time, we think, yes, now we have understood this. But we should always be open. And that is, in my experience, also the feast of science, that it's always open. It's always moments. And the next moment it may change. And of course, when you believe that science is basically the art of asking questions, then what happens is that you allow a lot of space for uncertainty. And that is important to see, because in the end, however much I admire what colleagues in science do and however important it is, in the end, to the real great questions of humanity, the questions of life and death, and the questions of suffering, science is without words. We are speechless. Now, does that mean that in global crisis, science has no role to play? No, to the contrary. I think we have a lot of scientific findings that can be used in decision-making process. Findings on ecological problems, on global warming, findings on epidemic diseases, findings on all kinds of issues. And those findings should be used and should be discussed and should be part of the policy-making process. But there is some caveats. The caveats are like this. What I've seen happening in the COVID crisis was that the request of governments for the certainty of scientists was so strong that many scientists, certainly in my country, fell into the trap of becoming rock stars. They were certainly celebrities. They were every evening on television, and they were in all the television talk shows, even if they had nothing to say. And I think that's not good for the reputation of science. We have to be more careful. Secondly, we need to realize that our findings are often used by politicians as alibis, behind which they shelter against accountability. So we need to make clear all the time that we are only the experts, giving our opinions based on what we think we know and what we do not know. But the decision makers are the politicians. That should be a very clear, and that was a bit confused, at least in my country over the past month. It was very confused as to who were the real decision makers. As our prime minister kept saying, we totally trust our scientists, we follow them. And that, I think, should not have happened. And then the last thing, coming back to what Giulietta Fiero was saying, I think the role of science in global crisis can only be effective once we establish new relationships between science and society. Once we can make clear to society what science is all about and what the limits to science is and how to understand science. So I think that we can only be effective if we engage in a massive effort by scientists to make ourselves understood by society. And I like to refer back to what Giulietta Fiero was saying. I mean, what you are doing, Giulietta, on Netflix is a wonderful example of what should be done. The way in which you can explain issues like astronomical issues and issues like dark matter. That's really wonderful. But that doesn't happen enough. That should be such an enormous global effort of all of us to talk to all these categories that you mentioned. And I would like to add, particularly, let's talk to children. The smart ones, I mean, the best. I always say kids, when they are 5 or 6, are the best philosophers. And they can handle complex issues. So they really deserve to be taken seriously and be part of this whole process of the outreach of science. And lastly, I think science should be fun, serious fun. And it strikes me always when I travel around the world and visit different universities, they're usually fairly gloomy and drab places. There's very little laughter in science. And I think, that's what we should try to change with each other. It seems to me that in education, the only laughter is the laughter of little kids on the playground of the school. They have fun, but also we adults as scientists, should engage in some conviviality and having fun with each other. But in the end of the day, science is a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, Cees. Again, we're raising a lot of questions. I'll try to, I think now let's try and engage in a joint conversation. So I think on one hand, we see some calls from Vandana Shiva on transcending interdisciplinarity. And I was struck by your call for openness, plurality, and honesty. I think some fundamental values, I think in recognizing our ultra-connectedness and the collapse of, let's say, Eurocentric science paradigms, this call for these type of values. I think that connects well to Ndlovu Gacheni's issues around ecologies of knowledge as well, and situating that call within the definition of an epistemic crisis. But you also raised the question, Ndlovu Gacheni, on that we are managing a crisis. But I mean, my question would also be, how do we move beyond some of these problematic issues we are raising? I think both Giulietta and Cees speak to the complexities and the relationships between scientists, us, and politicians on one side. Cees, you spoke to that, and society and industry. For example, that the Giulietta rose. So I think there are these different stakeholders that have to come together around some of these issues, but we probably disagree. These stakeholders disagree on the starting point, because they speak from different positionalities. So I don't know if you want to comment. Who wants to comment first on some of these tensions that are being raised? Vandana, please.
When knowledge and science actually shape the making of tools, then the tools are guided by science, the semiconductor technology and getting phones like this. But, I was forced to look at agriculture because some of the most prosperous parts of my country were blowing up. Punjab was blowing up in '84. The Bhopal disaster killed thousands of people with the pesticide leak. I did a book for the United Nations University. I said, I need to study what's going on. And the book is called The Violence of the Green Revolution. And that's when I understood so much more. First, I realized that it wasn't science that created the chemicals, but the need for genocide that looked for chemicals, even though they might not have had the full scientific system. And I'm talking of Hitler's concentration camps, which is where the Xylon bees, etc. evolved. After the wars, it's not the case that Africa didn't have its knowledge systems of agriculture. India has some of the most sophisticated. In fact, the Agricultural Testament written by Albert Howard when he was sent to India in 1905, he says, I can't improve this agriculture. I will make the Indian peasants my professor. That is science, where the top scientists of England can be humble enough to say, I don't know enough, and I'm going to learn from the peasants. And he became the father of modern organic farming. But when I was doing my book and looking at research, do we have a science of agriculture? Do we have a Eurocentric science of agriculture? No. What we have is leftover war chemicals looking for a market. And they create a theory. So they create a theory of empty soil as a container to pour nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Seed as an empty container to manipulate with GMOs. This is not science, because this is not about how the sophisticated soil system and soil organisms work. Zero knowledge of the soil food web. Nothing about the seed as an evolutionary potential enfolded in that amazing seed. So at least in the areas of the so-called life sciences of today, the industrial, whether it be industrial ag or it be industrial medicine, big ag, big pharma, and they're not different. The same buyer bought Monsanto, and it's the agrichemical company, but it is also the pharmaceutical company. So for them, people getting very sick is very, very good. My most recent book is called Oneness versus the 1%. And I was trying to solve the problem. How come the big tech giants are overnight deciding every sphere of our life? Without knowledge, without science, but they've seen a market. And I want to just quickly give a quote. I suddenly found Google is one of the biggest life sciences industries now. And I'm reading their patents. It's unbelievable, their patents, what they want to do with our body without taking guidance from the amazing richness of what the human body is and what health is from the diverse traditions available. You know what they're saying? It's as if Bacon has come out of his grave. He said, we have to defeat Mother Nature. Now, if that is the mentality you come with, then you have to declare war against the body, and you will not even manage health. You will actually create disease. So I think we are definitely at a watershed of uncertainty, but I don't think we are at the end of the arrogance of and totalitarianism of Eurocentrism. It is on fast forward. While it's panicking, let's make as much money fast as we can.
Thank you. So we haven't reached the peak of that tension yet. And at the same time, we see these other emerging or knowledge systems and ecologies coming forward.
And just one little other observation, Thomas.
Yes.
Just think of it. In today's world, look at us. How are we talking? We're talking digitally. Yeah? Now, because I question the Monsantos of the world, I know how much digital censorship takes place. My website has been pulled down. My articles get pulled down. So here is a group controlling your health, controlling your agriculture, controlling what we call science, which science will be recognized, controlling the science communication. This is the issue that we have to face.
Giulietta, do you want to comment on that? Thank you, Vandana.
I'd just like to mention that I think outreach should include the limits of science. I disagree with Sabelo. I think scientists knew there was going to be this bubble inflation in economics. They knew a virus was coming. They knew since SARS appeared. They knew due to the Spanish influenza. But it's like an earthquake. You can't know when and where and how severe it will be. So I believe you're right. When we carry out outreach, we should be very careful not to pretend that science knows all. Quite the contrary. Goebbels proved with a theorem a long time ago that science will never know the truth. And that's the way it is. And I agree with Seth. We should stress that the important thing is to make good questions. And that's why I love giving public talks, because I always say I don't know. And I'm so happy because I know this child that made this wonderful question has the mind of a scientist. And I encourage him to pursue science. And I also believe it's important to be creative. Every time I give a public lecture, I always encourage people to invent something new every day with a clip. Every week, once a week, they should invent something new with a clip. And if they do this, they will enhance their creativity. It's amazing, but one can actually do this. So I believe you're absolutely right. Science is about asking good questions. We will never achieve the truth, which is great because we will always have a good job. That's something I also mentioned. If you're a scientist, you will always find some good job as long as you ask the good questions. Thank you.
Cees, you have a...
Well, before you get Sabelo the word, because he also talked about disciplinarity. And I think that some of the things that we are talking about, like the outreach and getting children involved and having fun with science and asking questions and so on and so forth. Some of the major obstacles against that creativity, which is so wonderful in science, are indeed the disciplines. Because disciplines, as we know them now, did not come from an academic consideration. There was never a philosophy of knowledge debate on should we create this or that science. all the disciplines, came as a response to social phenomena. I mean, like anthropology reacted to imperialism and colonialism. And sociology came in existence as a answer to dealing with the French Revolution. So they are artificial principles, the principles of management for running a university, for dealing with funds, for dealing with publications, and so on and so forth. And that's why, I know that sounds a bit radical, but that's why I see us move from monodisciplinarity to multidisciplinarity. And then we need transdisciplinarity, which means we involve also non-scientific sources of knowledge. We deal with multiple knowledges. And then I would like to see us make the next step, which I call extra-disciplinarity. Just step out of the disciplines and look at this wonderful world and these wonderful human beings and the wonderful non-human animals. Look at them with amazement and with respect and with love, and trying to understand them. And when that happens, then I think, and I'd like to come back to what Shiva was saying about Bacon, torturing the secrets out of nature. I think the fundamental question, I'd like to hear Sabelo comment on this, because with all these problems of African epistemology and Asian epistemology and Western Eurocentric epistemology, that I think that leads me in the end to a more universal question, and it is, why do we try to get knowledge? What motivates us? Really, you mentioned honesty, Vandana. Let's, in an honest way, as academics and scientists, look at what moves us to create new knowledge. Is that still the Baconian desire of dominion? And we seem to be obsessed throughout our history, with dominating others, domesticating animals, domesticating other human beings, domesticating agriculture. We tried to domesticate Mother Gaia, and there we really failed. With all the technology, she became a formidable opponent. So, but is it about dominion, domestication, or is it about liberation? Do we create knowledge to make human beings in the Enlightenment tradition autonomous and free human beings that can decide for themselves? And do we break out of this anthropocentric bubble? And do we respect all living beings in their autonomy? That would be, that would, for me, be the crucial question for us in the beginning of the 21st century to address. Where are we going? Domestication or liberation?
Where are we going, Professor Sabelo? Do you want to comment on that?
Thank you. So many things are coming. One of the issues which is also emerging here also is a question, and I think we need to react to it very carefully, is the issue of the relationship between epistemology and ontology. And if I can use the lighter one, knowledge and reality. And I want to posit perhaps a rather simplistic version of it, of saying, I think why we're invested in knowledge is that knowledge creates reality. And I will put that again open for debate. Then the second issue which I want to respond to from CES is the issue of disciplines. The issue of disciplines, I'm also trained in a discipline. I'm actually a historian. But one of the issues which, from where I'm located here in South Africa, those who are reading, they will understand that we're actually dealing with a bigger question, which is defined in terms of transforming the university or decolonizing the university, and that question, which was brought to the fore, I think more forcibly by the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall student movements in 2016, 2015. It's a question which actually put the university on the defensive, and it put the university on the defensive in the sense that the university then became questioned in terms of its is complicity in slavery, complicity in colonialism, complicity in apartheid. And up to now, as somebody who works within the admin of a university, we are still struggling to really deal with restoring the legitimacy of the university after these the very, very scathing questions. And when we move then deeper into the mechanics of how to do the decolonization or the transformation, the question of disciplines arises. And it arises in this way. That indeed, as Ses is saying, the disciplines emerged at a particular moment in history to deal with particular problems. But the question of today, are they up to speed with the problems of today?
Yeah, right.
This is where we are. And they were saying, if they were actually indeed, they emerged trying to deal with the problems of industrial revolution, French Revolution, and all that, is that still relevant today? And is it still relevant in the global south, in South Africa, in Africa, and the other parts of the world? So these are the questions which then lead us to then think about the disciplines. And some go to the extent of saying, I think we always limit ourselves by thinking disciplinary. We will need to really confront human problems rather than always, when you see an accident, you say, as a historian, I think this way, as a psychologist, I think this way, as a biologist, I think this way. Why don't you focus on the problem rather than actually always wearing the spectacles of a discipline? Are those spectacles not actually making you not to see other things? So that's one aspect. Then coming to Julieta about my two examples of the 2008 financial crisis. By 2008, I was actually working at the Open University in the UK, and I remember a meeting which took place at London School of Economics, where the Queen of England actually asked the economist, why didn't you see the crisis coming? They never gave the answer which you are giving that we knew. They actually said, I think 2 of them responded immediately. Then later, 10 of them, including some from Australia, responded. And their response went exactly to the disciplinary question. And they argued that the problem is actually the problem of economics, which has become quantitative, which have lost psychology, philosophy, and therefore it is no longer predictive of some of the problems. So that's why I was coming in from that perspective.
What you're speaking to also speaks to the tension between that Ses raised in the beginning about this tension between politics and science. The politicians need urgent responses, but science are slow thinking beings, and maybe also disciplinary developments are slow in responding and contemplating society. So we will maybe see the response come with a backlog or delay to this type of crisis we're experiencing right now. Could I ask you now, maybe we have a few minutes left, if you would like to have like a final remark. Maybe we can take the round we had in the beginning, starting by Vandana, Julieta, Sabelo, and Ses. Just a few remarks to wrap up the panel. I think we've had some excellent questions raised and tensions uncovered. Well, what would be the way forward? Could that be a question to ask?
So, so many of my recent research studies have been to understand systems of domination, but find systems of peace. And I'm increasingly saying we need to replace the monoculture of the mind that came from Europe and the domination with a biodiversity of the mind. Not just the fact that all living beings have minds. I think that is the mistake that was made with the idea of dead earth. Plants have intelligence, soil organisms have intelligence, animals have intelligence, and our bodies are intelligent. The new work on the gut microbiome is showing it, it's calling it the second brain. So distributed intelligence everywhere, therefore distributed knowledge everywhere. the biodiversity of the mind is also going beyond the mechanistic linear mode of thinking to the multiplicity of interactions of which we are a part. And over these 5 decades now of working on ecology, for me, science, real science, is about a dialogue. It's about a dialogue with nature, and it's a dialogue in community. And some of my best teachers have been illiterate village women who know so much how systems work. And the forester might know 2 species, they know 500. Yeah? They know exactly what will heal you. The doctors experiment on you. And I feel this bringing dignity to all knowledges, epistemic freedom, as you mentioned. But epistemic freedom means getting rid of the colonization of the mind and the colonization of knowledge.
Thank you very much, Vandana. That was good. Giulietta, please.
Well, I feel that there's so much to do. There's so many things that should be included in outreach, all this thinking out of the bucket, including ways of thinking about other cultures, emphasizing that scientists are slow learners and slow thinkers and ignorant people, and that we don't have the tools to answer all the questions. So it was great being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giulietta. On to you, Professor Sabelo, please.
I think one thing which we need not to run away from is the issue of the epistemic crisis, which we're actually facing. And I think thinkers such as Gramsci were quite fine when they were thinking about an interregnum, whereby one knowledge which used to be useful is actually showing signs of exhaustion, but another new knowledge which is needed to take us forward has not yet actually emerged. And I think we need really to understand this situation that way. And one of why I'm saying that, because unless we name the crisis we are in correctly, we'll have problems. Because one of the issues is that an epistemic crisis does not present itself as an epistemic crisis. It manifests itself in institutions, systems. And you will see it as a systemic or an institutional crisis when it is an epistemic crisis. That would be my parting shot.
Food for thought. Thank you very much. Finally, Says, please.
Thank you, Thomas. I just like to use this opportunity to thank the executive board of the IMCR for agreeing to create space for this panel. All the years that I've been with the association, I've always wanted to liberate ourselves from our monodisciplinary exchanges and to look at a broader dialogue on epistemological and science theoretical issues. In the beginning of our association in the 1950s, we had a very strong practical focus on the training of journalists. And as we evolved, we became more of a scientific association and a scientific platform. And I think today what we did with this panel, we honored the fact that there's a scientific association and a scientific platform for the study of communication and media in the broader context of our contemporary realities.
Thank you very much. I think that was a good note to end on, Says, putting our own science into this broader context of larger questions. I thank you all for your participation in today's panel, and look forward to seeing you at some point in real life as well.